Imagine this. It's a busy evening at the airport. The boarding gates are crowded with passengers, each of them visibly drained after hours of delays and cancellations. By the time the announcement comes, Flight 247 to New York is finally boarding. You can feel the collective wave of relief in the air. People hurriedly grab their belongings, eager to get seated and on their way. But that relief is short-lived. As passengers shuffle down the aisle, the mood quickly shifts. A young child, no older than 3 or 4, begins to cry. At first, it's just a whimper, the kind of noise people can usually ignore. But then it escalates. The crying grows louder, sharper, and more persistent. It cuts through the cabin like a knife, drawing attention from every direction. You can almost feel the passengers' patience beginning to crack, their faces tightening with frustration as they glance over their shoulders to pinpoint the source of the disruption. The child's mother, visibly frazzled, tries her best to console her little one. She's rocking the child in her arms, softly whispering words of comfort, but nothing seems to work. The crying continues, echoing through the confined space of the plane. Now, here's where things take a turn. A few rows back, there's a man, mid-40s, sharply dressed, the type who looks like he travels for business more often than leisure. From the moment he boarded, he's been muttering under his breath, clearly irritated by the delay. But now, the crying child has become his focus. You can see his irritation boiling over. He's fidgeting in his seat, rolling his eyes, sighing loudly as if to signal his displeasure to everyone around him. And then it happens. Without warning, he snaps. His voice cuts through the cabin like a whip. "Can't you shut that kid up?" He yells, loud enough for everyone to hear. The entire plane goes silent. Passengers freeze mid-motion, their jaws dropping at the audacity of his outburst. The mother looks up, stunned, her face flushing with embarrassment. People start whispering, the tension thick enough to slice with a knife. But the man doesn't stop there. Why would you bring a kid on a plane if you can't control them? This is why people hate flying. He adds, shaking his head in frustration. And just as you think the situation can't get any worse, someone a few rows away slowly stands up. It's a woman, calm, composed, but with an undeniable air of authority. She looks directly at the man, her expression unreadable. What she says next, and who she turns out to be, will leave the entire plane in stunned silence. Because this man had no idea who he was yelling in front of, or the chain of events he had just unleashed. Stay tuned, because what happened next is a story that none of those passengers would ever forget. The flight was supposed to leave hours ago, but as is often the case with air travel, delays had piled up one after the other. By the time the passengers were finally allowed to board Flight 247 to New York, exhaustion and frustration hung heavy in the air. It was one of those flights where you could feel the tension even before stepping into the cabin. The announcement over the loudspeakers, "We are now ready to board," had triggered a flurry of activity in the crowded gate area. People scrambled to gather their belongings, clutching their boarding passes and carry-ons like lifelines as they shuffled toward the gate. The impatience was almost palpable. As the passengers began filing into the plane, the chaos didn't dissipate. Instead, it seemed to intensify. The flight attendants were trying their best to manage the boarding process, directing people to their seats and reminding them to stow their luggage in the overhead bins. The cabin was already buzzing with murmurs of discontent, complaints about the delay, arguments over overhead space, and the occasional loud sigh of someone just trying to get through the ordeal. Amidst all this, a young mother stepped onto the plane, holding her child tightly in her arms. She was in her early 30s, dressed in comfortable travel clothes, jeans, a loose sweater, and sneakers. Her face bore the signs of someone already at her wits' end. The child in her arms, a little boy no older than 3, clung to her like a lifeline. He had wide, tear-filled eyes and a look of sheer overwhelm. The noise, the bright lights, the sea of strangers. It was all too much for him. The mother whispered soothing words into his ear, her tone soft and reassuring. But the little boy was inconsolable. His crying started as a low whimper, but as they made their way down the aisle, it quickly escalated into full-blown sobs. Other passengers noticed immediately. How could they not? The sound of a child crying in an enclosed space like an airplane is impossible to ignore. Some passengers glanced up with mild curiosity before turning their attention back to their phones, books, or magazines. Others, however, were less discreet. An older man in the aisle seat of row 15 openly rolled his eyes, muttering something under his breath about parenting these days. A woman 2 rows ahead let out an audible sigh of exasperation as she adjusted her neck pillow. Meanwhile, a teenage girl with headphones in her ears turned up the volume on her music, her expression a mixture of annoyance and pity. For the mother, the reactions were painfully obvious. She could feel the weight of their judgment as she walked past, searching for her assigned seat. The whispers, the stares, the passive-aggressive sighs. They all cut through her like a blade. She adjusted her hold on the child, bouncing him slightly in her arms in an effort to calm him down. But nothing worked. The boy's cries continued to pierce through the air, echoing off the walls of the cabin. It wasn't just crying. It was the kind of raw, desperate wailing that only a small child can muster, the sound of pure distress. The mother finally reached her seat, a window seat near the middle of the plane. She struggled to maneuver herself and the child into the narrow row, all while trying to keep her composure. The passengers seated around her exchanged knowing glances, their expressions ranging from mild discomfort to outright irritation. A man in the aisle seat next to her groaned audibly as she tried to settle in, his body language screaming that he wanted no part of this. She muttered an apology, her voice barely audible over the crying. The flight attendants, who were still busy assisting other passengers, glanced in the direction of the crying but didn't intervene. They had their hands full with the usual pre-flight chaos, ensuring everyone was seated, answering questions, and dealing with the inevitable last-minute baggage issues. For now, the crying was just one more element of the already stressful situation. And then there was the man in row 18. He had boarded the plane a few minutes earlier, carrying a sleek leather briefcase and a look of utter disdain for the world around him. He was the kind of man who exuded an air of self-importance, the type who probably spent more time in airports than at home. From the moment he sat down, he'd been fidgeting, adjusting his tie, checking his watch, and letting out frustrated sighs as the boarding process dragged on. The crying child was the final straw for him. You could see it in his body language, the stiffened shoulders, the clenched jaw. He wasn't just annoyed. He was seething. The stage was set. A plane full of tired, stressed passengers. A crying child whose mother was doing everything she could to soothe him. And one man whose patience was about to snap. What no one knew yet was that this ordinary flight was about to take an extraordinary turn. One that would leave every passenger with a story they'd never forget. The camera pans over the chaotic cabin, the cramped quarters, the murmurs of other passengers, and the overhead bins rattling as people scramble to get comfortable. But then, the attention shifts. We focus on a man in his mid-40s, dressed in a dark suit, his tie slightly askew from the stress of a long day of travel. His briefcase sits firmly on his lap, its edges pressed against his thighs in an almost defensive manner. His name? Richard Hale. He's a business traveler on a tight schedule, and his face says it all, tired, irritated, and out of patience. Richard's fingers tap nervously on the armrest of his seat, his eyes darting from one thing to the next in an almost predatory fashion. The flight had been delayed, frustrating, but it's not like it's his first time dealing with travel setbacks. He's accustomed to airports and long hours, but what he's not used to is the unbearable sound of a child's crying echoing through the cabin, like a jagged, unforgiving noise that cuts through the dull hum of the plane. At first, Richard tries to block it out, shifting his weight in his seat, pulling his tie a little tighter, adjusting the sleeve of his jacket as though the cry could somehow be a metaphor for his own discomfort. He closes his eyes, pretending it's just background noise. But that cry, it doesn't stop. It doesn't soften. It grows louder, more intense with each passing minute, a rhythmic, high-pitched wail that reverberates in his skull. He opens his eyes, shooting a glance toward the back of the plane, where the sound seems to be coming from. His jaw tightens, his lips pressed into a thin line of irritation. The source of this torment? A young mother, her face flushed, holding her toddler tightly in her arms, trying with all her might to calm the child. Richard's first instinct is to sigh, long, deep, and frustrated. He shifts uncomfortably in his seat. The constant wailing, the persistent cries for attention, the helplessness in the mother's eyes. It all adds up in Richard's mind as a failure of the people around him to keep the peace in such a confined space. He mutters under his breath, barely audible, but enough for those nearby to catch it. This is unbelievable. His irritation builds, not just because of the child's cries, but because of the overwhelming sense of powerlessness he feels, trapped in this small, noisy tube of a plane, unable to escape from the chaos. His mind races as he thinks of all the calls he needs to make once the flight is over, the meetings he must attend, the work piling up. Time is money, and right now, it feels like both are slipping away because of this child's cry. He shifts again, more agitated now, tapping his fingers on the armrest in rapid succession. His gaze darts toward the mother, who is trying so hard to soothe the child. Her lips are moving, likely offering reassurances, but it's clear the child isn't responding. The mother glances apologetically at the surrounding passengers, her face flushed with embarrassment. She says a few words, likely a quiet apology, but her voice is drowned out by the cacophony of noise that surrounds them. Richard glances around, and he sees it too, the other passengers. Some are pretending to ignore it, their eyes glued to their phones or magazines, but there's no mistaking the discomfort in their body language. The looks of annoyance, the quiet sighs that punctuate the hum of the plane. And it's not just Richard. There are the businessmen a few rows up, shifting in their seats. The woman across the aisle is glaring, her lips pursed, eyes narrowing as she glances at the child. It's the universal signal, frustration, discomfort, the shared experience of being inconvenienced by a child who can't stop crying. Richard mutters again, his voice sharper this time, as if to make sure those around him hear his growing displeasure. Why don't they just take care of that? He grumbles, his words pointed, almost accusing. The mother, still trying to calm her child, offers a weak smile to the other passengers, her voice now barely audible as she apologizes. I'm so sorry. She's just overwhelmed. She'll calm down soon. But Richard's eyes narrow. His patience is slipping fast. The sound of the crying child seems to be slowly twisting inside his mind, amplifying the stress he's already under from the delayed flight and the never-ending work demands. His thoughts become clouded with irritation. He shifts in his seat again, his hands gripping the armrest as he watches the mother struggle. The more she apologizes, the more Richard's frustration grows. It's as though the very act of apologizing is an admission of failure to him, one that only heightens his desire for someone to take control of the situation. His voice, low and sharp, cuts through the tension in the cabin. Maybe she should just take her out of here, he suggests, more to himself than anyone else, but loud enough for the people around him to hear. I'm sure the kid would be better off away from all this. A few people in the surrounding seats glance nervously at each other, unsure whether to speak up or not. The discomfort in the air is palpable, and Richard can feel his temper rising with each minute that ticks by. The child's cries, despite the mother's best efforts, have no sign of stopping. The thought of an endless flight with no respite weighs heavily on him. The mother's attempts to soothe the child become more frantic, her voice now softer, almost pleading. Sure, honey, it's okay. I know it's loud, but we'll be there soon. But the cries continue. They are relentless. The stress is palpable, building in waves, and Richard can feel it gnawing at him, like a physical force pressing against his chest. He can't ignore it any longer. His hand shoots out, reaching for the button to call the flight attendant. He presses it twice, impatiently. The flight attendant, a woman in her mid-30s with short, dark hair, appears from the front of the cabin, sensing the tension in the air. Richard leans forward, his voice now more clipped and stern than ever. Excuse me, he says, his voice low but unmistakably annoyed. Isn't there something that can be done? This is unbearable. The flight attendant's eyes flicker toward the mother and child, then back to Richard. She nods, but her expression says it all. There's not much she can do. I'll speak with the mother, sir, she says, her tone polite but laced with the recognition of a delicate situation. Richard leans back in his seat, his arms crossed tightly, his face set in a grimace. He watches the flight attendant approach the mother, and for a moment, he wonders if his frustration will ever ease. He thinks to himself that this situation is one of those that has the power to ruin a flight, to ruin the experience for everyone. And right now, he doesn't care if it's just a kid. He wants quiet. He wants relief. As the flight attendant approaches the mother, Richard's frustration reaches a boiling point. His thoughts begin to spiral. Could this situation have been avoided? Should the mother have done something sooner? Was she aware of how much her child's cries were bothering everyone else? And then, the flight attendant's voice carries softly over the quiet buzz of the plane, trying to comfort the mother as the tension continues to rise. As the flight hummed through the air, the tension in the cabin was rising. The low murmurs of passengers, the constant shifting in seats, and the mechanical drone of the airplane's engines almost seemed to fade into the background as one sound became the undeniable focus of the room, the incessant wail of a young child. It had been going on for a while now. The mother, despite her best efforts, had been unable to calm the toddler, who was no more than 3 years old. Tears streaked down the child's red face, and no amount of soothing words, gentle rocking, or soft whispers could provide any comfort. The noise cut through the cabin like a knife. The high-pitched cries bounced off the walls, echoing throughout the small space. At first, there were only a few subtle glances exchanged. A roll of the eyes here, a sigh there. Most passengers had their own battles to fight. Some were just hoping to make it through the flight without any further disruption. Others were already deep in thought, trying to settle into the long hours ahead, while some tried to drown out the noise with the buzz of their headphones or the flicker of their screens. But for one particular passenger, the noise was becoming unbearable. He was a businessman, late 30s, early 40s, dressed in a neatly pressed suit, his tie a little loosened but still professional. His fingers drummed nervously on the armrest, his lips tight with irritation. At first, he'd muttered under his breath, an inaudible string of complaints that he probably didn't think anyone could hear. But as the crying continued, it became clear that he wasn't going to tolerate it for much longer. "Ugh," he muttered, his voice a sharp whisper, his face twisted in frustration, the signs of impatience growing more visible. He glanced around, and as his eyes met the mother's, the silent reproach seemed to land with a heavy weight. Yet, despite the look, she didn't respond. She just continued to try everything she could to soothe her child. It wasn't enough. The minutes dragged on, and with every passing second, his irritation grew. The businessman shifted in his seat again, and a visible sigh left his chest. His eyes scanned the cabin, finding little sympathy in the faces of the people around him. He clenched his jaw. Finally, unable to contain it any longer, his voice cut through the air like a knife. "Can't you control your kid?" he snapped, the words sharp and biting. His voice was loud enough that the entire row of seats seemed to freeze in place, the noise of the plane dulling momentarily under the weight of his words. A stunned silence fell over the cabin. The air grew thick with the shock of the outburst. It was as though time had stopped. Even the child, mid-sob, seemed to pause for a brief moment, sensing the sudden shift in energy. Every passenger turned their heads, eyes wide in surprise. Some looked on in disbelief, others with a sense of discomfort. It was a moment that felt almost unreal, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. The mother's face turned crimson. She froze, caught in a moment of utter humiliation. Her hands instinctively tightened around the child, who had now gone silent, perhaps confused by the sudden tension. Her eyes darted around, desperately searching for some form of understanding, some sign that someone would come to her defense. But no one did. All she could do was look down at her child, her face a mix of embarrassment, frustration, and exhaustion. For a moment, the mother's mind raced. Should she say something? Should she apologize again, even though she already had? She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The silence in the cabin felt suffocating, the weight of the man's accusation hanging heavily in the air. Around the cabin, murmurs started to build. People exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in quiet disbelief, others casting pointed looks at the businessman. There was a collective shift in the energy of the room. Passengers who had once been lost in their own worlds now became intensely aware of the conflict unfolding before them. Whispers began to ripple through the rows. "What's his problem?" one passenger muttered under her breath. "She's just trying to calm her kid," another whispered, shaking their head. There were others who, though they may have felt sympathy for the child, looked at the situation with a sense of quiet judgment. They, too, were feeling the discomfort of the moment, unsure of how to react. As the businessman continued to stare at the mother, his gaze unwavering, the tension in the cabin grew even thicker. The mother's face flushed a deeper shade of red, the tears threatening to well up in her eyes as she attempted, once again, to soothe her child. But this time, her voice too. The silence in the cabin wasn't just a lack of sound. It was the heavy pressure of a dozen uncomfortable, watching eyes. And for one moment, it felt as though no one knew how to move forward. The situation had tipped into something far beyond a simple moment of discomfort. It had become a spectacle, one where each person's role in the drama was being quietly analyzed, judged, and processed. And still, the child continued to cry. The atmosphere in the cabin has reached a boiling point. The silence is thick, almost suffocating, as the harsh words from the frustrated passenger still echo in the air. Every passenger holds their breath, eyes fixed on the interaction unfolding before them. The mother, her face flushed with embarrassment, tightens her grip around her child, trying her best to ignore the murmurs of disapproval that swirl through the cabin. But what happens next, no one saw coming. From the back of the plane, a man stands up. At first, he seems like just another traveler, perhaps a businessman or an average passenger. But there's something about him that commands attention. The cabin, already filled with tension, seems to shift as the man rises from his seat with an almost serene calmness, making his way down the narrow aisle. He's tall, dressed sharply, with an air of quiet authority. His every movement is deliberate, his gaze steady. As he approaches, the passengers around him part slightly, giving him space. It's as if they all sense something is about to change. The man's presence is undeniable. Something in the way he carries himself makes everyone stop whispering and look. The tension shifts, all eyes now on him, wondering why he's stepping in. He reaches the row where the confrontation is taking place, and all eyes follow him. The angry passenger, still fuming and with his arms crossed in defiance, watches the man approach, but doesn't seem to recognize him. The mother, caught in the middle of the chaos, seems both relieved and apprehensive as the stranger draws closer. And then, in a voice that is calm, yet firm, the man speaks, his words breaking the silence like a crack of thunder. "I'm sorry," he says, his voice carrying through the cabin, "but what you just did was unacceptable." The man pauses, allowing the words to sink in. The angry passenger, still simmering, doesn't react immediately, but there's a noticeable shift in the energy in the cabin. It's as if the temperature of the room drops, and everyone leans in, waiting for what will happen next. The man's gaze turns to the mother, who is now looking up at him with a mixture of confusion and gratitude. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asks her, his tone softening. The mother, still flustered, nods, not entirely sure who this person is or why he's intervening. Her child, still crying, squirms in her arms, but she seems somewhat relieved that someone is standing up for her. Then, the man turns back to the angry passenger, his eyes narrowing with quiet authority. "I am the CEO of this airline," he says, revealing a piece of information that completely shifts the atmosphere. A gasp ripples through the cabin. The passengers, who had been quietly observing, now look at the man in disbelief. The idea that the CEO of the airline is on this very flight, sitting among them and witnessing this chaos, seems almost surreal. The angry passenger, who had been ready to argue, suddenly pales. He's caught off guard, unsure how to respond, the realization dawning on him that he has just yelled at someone who holds immense power over the very flight he's on. But the CEO isn't done. He turns to address the passengers, his voice steady but full of weight. "As a parent, I can understand how difficult it can be to calm a child on a plane," he continues. "But there is no excuse for being disrespectful to another passenger, especially when that person is doing their best to manage a challenging situation. The cabin is now utterly still, the passengers holding their breath, hanging on every word. Some people, who had been silently judging the mother earlier, now exchange uncomfortable glances. It's clear that the balance of power has shifted dramatically. The CEO's words hit hard, not just because of what he said, but because of who he is. His position in the airline industry makes his stance undeniable, and no one is going to challenge him now. The angry passenger, who had been so sure of his indignation moments ago, looks suddenly small. He opens his mouth, but no words come out. He's completely disarmed by the CEO's presence and his powerful words. The CEO doesn't allow the silence to linger for too long. He turns to the flight attendant, who has been standing by, watching the drama unfold. Please, ensure that this situation is resolved peacefully. This kind of behavior will not be tolerated on any flight I oversee. The flight attendant nods, visibly relieved that someone in authority has taken control of the situation. The cabin, which had been filled with tension and frustration, now feels a bit lighter. Passengers exchange nervous smiles, unsure of how to react but grateful that someone has stepped in to stop the conflict. The mother, still holding her child, looks up at the CEO with wide eyes. "Thank you," she says, her voice shaky but full of gratitude. The CEO nods at her and then turns back toward the front of the plane, his task done. As he walks away, the atmosphere in the cabin slowly returns to normal, but the weight of the interaction lingers in the air. The once boiling tension in the cabin has dissipated, and though the child continues to cry softly in the background, the passengers seem to breathe a little easier now. The scene that had been filled with anger and judgment has shifted into something else entirely. A reminder that, sometimes, all it takes is one person to stand up and make a difference. The angry passenger, now sitting quietly, is left to reflect on the unexpected turn of events. And the rest of the flight goes on. But for those who witnessed the confrontation, it's a moment that will stay with them long after the plane lands. The powerful lesson that kindness, patience, and understanding can come from the most unexpected of places, even in the most tense and uncomfortable of situations. The sudden silence in the cabin is palpable as the authoritative figure takes his place. The CEO, a man of calm demeanor and sharp intelligence, doesn't raise his voice. Instead, his words carry a weight that commands attention, and the room holds its breath as he begins to address the angry passenger. "Excuse me," he says in a calm, measured tone, his voice resonating throughout the cabin. "I believe you've mistaken the situation here. This child, who you seem so upset by, is struggling just like any of us would in an overwhelming, stressful situation." His gaze is unwavering as he looks at the agitated passenger. There's no anger in his words, only understanding. But it's the sort of understanding that makes everyone in the cabin stop and think. The yelling passenger stiffens, clearly caught off guard by the interruption. At first, they try to brush it off, muttering something under their breath about having a right to complain about the noise. But the CEO continues, unbothered by the resistance. "You have every right to be uncomfortable," he says, his tone still calm, but with an unmistakable authority. "We all do. But we don't have the right to take our discomfort out on others, especially not on someone who is already doing everything they can to manage a difficult situation." The mother, still holding her child in her arms, looks up, her face filled with a mixture of gratitude and surprise. She hadn't expected this kind of intervention. It wasn't just a matter of kindness now. It was an interruption to the judgmental atmosphere that had begun to take shape around her. She holds her child close, silently thanking the stranger who has come to her defense. The CEO pauses for a moment, and for the first time, the yelling passenger looks uncomfortable. The tone in the cabin shifts from tense to introspective. Everyone, it seems, is paying attention now. The powerful figure doesn't stop there. He shares a story, one that no one saw coming, and one that hits hard in the silence of the moment. "You know," he begins, his voice steady, "I've been in this situation before. I've sat next to crying children on flights, and I've felt the irritation building. But one of the most important lessons I've learned is this. Sometimes, we don't know the whole story. We don't know what the person next to us is dealing with, or what struggles they're facing. We don't know what might be happening in their lives that's making this moment even harder for them. His eyes soften as he looks at the mother and child, and then he addresses the angry passenger again. I had a similar moment years ago. I was on a flight, tired from a long trip, and I had the same thoughts. Why can't the parent control their child? But then, I realized that the parent didn't need judgment. They needed compassion. And maybe, just maybe, the world would be a little less tense if we started offering more of that. There's a long pause. The cabin is still, every passenger holding their breath, as they witness this turning point in the situation. The tension that once hung heavy in the air begins to dissipate, replaced by a quiet reflection. Even the most annoyed passengers have fallen silent, perhaps reconsidering their own thoughts about the situation. The yelling passenger shifts in their seat, suddenly realizing the gravity of what's just been said. Their defensive posture crumbles as they look down at their lap, perhaps embarrassed by the words that have been said to them. It's a moment of vulnerability, one that doesn't come easily to someone who's been so quick to lash out. They murmur an apology, a quiet one at first, not entirely sincere, but it's a start. The CEO doesn't let the moment linger in discomfort. He offers the passenger an out, an opportunity to make things right. We all make mistakes, he says, his tone now gentler. It's what we do after that matters. The mother, still holding her child, nods silently, her eyes brimming with appreciation. The crying has quieted, and there's a new sense of calm in the cabin. A quiet that feels warmer, more human. The angry passenger, now visibly humbled, nods back, almost sheepishly. The apology, though small, is enough to soften the tension that had been so palpable just moments before. Other passengers begin to shift in their seats, the atmosphere changing once again, this time to one of empathy. A few whisper words of support to the mother, others offer sympathetic glances to the once angry passenger, who is now lost in thought, reflecting on their actions. The moment, though tense, has opened up a dialogue about kindness, empathy, and the importance of seeing beyond our own discomfort. As the flight continues, the energy in the cabin has shifted. What started as a tense and uncomfortable moment has turned into something deeper, something that many passengers will carry with them long after they've disembarked. The unexpected twist, the CEO's intervention, has not only defused a potentially volatile situation, but has also reminded everyone on board about the power of compassion in difficult times. It's a lesson that, in the end, may be more valuable than any destination they could reach. And just like that, the flight continues, but the passengers on board are not the same as they were when they first boarded the plane. Something has changed, something subtle, but undeniably powerful. The cabin hums with a new sense of calm, and even the passengers who had been so quick to judge now sit back in their seats, perhaps a little more understanding, a little more patient, and a little more aware of how much a single moment of kindness can affect the world around them. As the tension in the cabin slowly dissipates, the mother, still cradling her child, looks up at the man who intervened. A sense of gratitude and relief washes over her, and her lips curl into a faint, appreciative smile. The once harsh glare in her eyes softens, as though she's been given a moment of peace amidst the storm. The influential man, who had calmly stood up for her, takes a seat once more, his authoritative stance now replaced by a quiet confidence. He offers a few reassuring words, telling her, "It's okay. Don't worry, everyone has their limits, and you're doing your best." His voice, although calm, carries the weight of experience, and it's enough to make the mother feel a sense of comfort she didn't expect on this flight. But it doesn't stop there. Gradually, other passengers begin to speak up, adding their own words of reassurance. An elderly woman sitting just a few rows ahead turns around and says, "You're doing great. Kids will be kids." A man in the row behind her nods in agreement, smiling, "Yeah, no one expects perfection. Don't worry about it." Even the once quiet passengers, who had been silently observing the altercation, now murmur words of support. The mother looks at each person, her heart swelling with a mixture of surprise and relief. She hadn't expected such empathy from strangers, especially after the difficult start to the flight. Her child, still fussy but comforted by the presence of the mother, begins to quiet down. With the support of those around her, the child's cries subside, and the noise in the cabin fades into a more peaceful hum. The flight attendants, who had remained in the background, now approached with kind smiles. One of them leans in gently and says, "Don't worry, we're here to help. If you need anything, just let us know." The warmth in her words solidifies the sense of safety, and the mother is finally able to let out a deep breath. As the plane begins to climb higher into the sky, the passengers around the mother seem to settle into their seats. The tension from earlier is replaced with an unspoken understanding. The child, now calm, rests in her mother's arms, and the flight continues smoothly, almost as though the earlier storm had never happened. We all have moments when our patience is tested, when life throws challenges our way in the most unexpected places. It's easy to let frustration or anger take over, especially when we feel overwhelmed. But what if, instead of letting our emotions rule us, we chose to respond with kindness, understanding, and empathy? In this story, the yelling passenger could have chosen to continue with frustration. But when confronted by someone who understood the situation, who stepped in with empathy, the outcome was completely different. It wasn't just about one person standing up. It was about a collective shift in the cabin, from judgment to understanding. And in that moment, everything changed. Kindness is powerful. In a world where we're often too quick to judge, taking a moment to understand someone's struggle can make all the difference. We may not always know what someone is going through, but a small act of empathy can shift the atmosphere in ways we can't always predict. So, what do you think? Have you ever witnessed a situation where empathy made a big difference? Or maybe you've been in a similar situation yourself. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us of the power of kindness. Thank you for watching, and remember, we all have the ability to make the world a little kinder, one act at a time.